Princeton A. The motion for this morning is that this House believes the West should recognize the Dalai Lama. Without further ado, I'd like to call on the Prime Minister to speak to the motion that stands in this.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. When the West is deciding questions of foreign policy, they should consider the principles involved and the pragmatics involved. We tell you that China's history of oppression of Tibet is indefensible, and going forward, recognizing the Dalai Lama is the pragmatic approach to ending this oppression and furthering the cause of Tibet. So let me talk about the model for just a minute, Madam Speaker. So we're talking about Western nations like the US, the EU, the UK, etc. So we say that the West should recognize the Dalai Lama is the spiritual and to some extent political leader of the Tibetan people, Madam Speaker. We would say that the West would call for Dalai Lama to be able to return from exile without being subject to abuses, Madam Speaker. We say that the West further threatens sanctions on China if they fail to bring to allow the Dalai Lama back into Tibet, and if they were to commit any sort of human rights abuses on the Dalai Lama. And we also ask that China begin negotiations in earnest with the Dalai Lama for greater autonomy in Tibet. I think that's pretty clear. We're going to have three arguments that we're going to advance on case, Madam Speaker. Firstly, we're going to talk about the principles involved. Secondly, we're going to talk about the pragmatics involved. And Grant's going to talk about improving further relations between the West and China. So firstly, Madam Speaker, the principles involved. I think it's absolutely clear that there's patterns of abuses that we've seen in Tibet being carried out by the Chinese government. Recognize, Madam Speaker, that Tibet has a history of independence. It was independent from 1911 until 1950, until China, unprovoked, invaded Tibet and took away its right to self-determination, its right to sovereignty, its right to continue as a nation, Madam Speaker. So we see this fundamental right, a violation of sovereignty. But consider all the other rights violations that we've seen in China. Or Tibet, rather. We've seen China systematically try and move in Chinese settlers such that the Tibetan people would become a minority in that country and wouldn't have the power or autonomy to be able to determine their own future, Madam Speaker. And so China could continue to reinforce their own claim that Tibet is actually a part of China. We've seen fundamental repression of religion, Madam Speaker. The traditional Buddhist monasteries, especially those that have been the most active in trying to oppose Chinese rule, have been shut down. China's trying to intervene in traditional religion. They're trying to appoint their own Dalai Lama. They're trying to appoint other spiritual leaders who are just a puppet for the Chinese government, Madam Speaker. China is fundamentally trying to crack down on protests. We saw this right before the Olympics in 2008, when in March, mostly monks who were largely nonviolent, Madam Speaker, rose up trying to fight for their own independence, and China brutally cracked down on them. No thank you. We see violations of freedom of speech. People aren't allowed to speak up for themselves, and violations of freedom of association. People who are fighting for Tibetan independence are not allowed to congregate. Sure.
Given the hostility China has evinced in the past, wouldn't this just create a tremendous backlash against the West?
Okay, I'm going to talk about that in the pragmatic section. I'll get to that, I promise. But Madam Speaker, I want to make this very clear. The Chinese government is literally trying to kill off the Tibetan people as a people. They're trying to lead to a sort of cultural genocide, Madam Speaker, through diluting the bloodline, through diluting their claim to actually having independence and being a people, Madam Speaker. So what does the West affirm when they say that the Dalai Lama is the leader of Tibet and say that there should be negotiations? They affirm the right to sovereignty. They affirm universal human rights, like no matter how powerful the government is, no matter how repressive a government might be, there's still rights to determine your own religion, to determine the future of the course of your people, to be able to associate and advocate for whatever political positions you want, Madam Speaker. We need to take a stand against these human rights abuses, and we need to take a stand for human rights protections. We do all of this by saying the Dalai Lama is the spiritual leader of Tibet, Tibet deserves some more independence, and China has to end the human rights abuses. We achieve all of that on our side of the House, Madam Speaker. Okay, secondly, pragmatics. So first of all, Madam Speaker, we recognize that China's suddenly not going to be like, okay, Tibet, you are off on your own, you can have your own nation. But there is a middle way, Madam Speaker, a middle way whereby the resettlement of ethnically Chinese people into Tibet ends, and where Tibet gets greater autonomy for himself, greater self-determination, and affirmations that it has its own right to religion and other sort of rights, Madam Speaker. Now recognize that both parties have shown a willingness to agree to this solution. The Dalai Lama has been willing to negotiate on multiple occasions and has allowed middle-level negotiators to come to the table with China to negotiate this very platform, Madam Speaker. Even China has shown a willingness to negotiate. In 2008, after the uprisings right before the Olympics, China recognized that they need to negotiate with these people and recognized that Tibet was going to deserve further autonomy. So they began middle-level negotiations with Tibetan officials, Madam Speaker, and representatives of the Dalai Lama. So both parties have at least given lip service to this middle way, Madam Speaker. They both, and this is much preferable because it'll end many of the human rights abuses. But recognize, Madam Speaker, the middle way is not sufficient because right now China isn't doing substantive negotiations, Madam Speaker. They're merely playing lip service to the revolt's end. This forces them to actually have substantive negotiations with the actual leader of their people. But why will this end repression, Madam Speaker? We think this will lead to negotiation, and China will agree to this because recognize that China needs the West, Madam Speaker. Economically, the West is their tool for economic development. Right now, China has mostly a manufacturing economy, are going through a period where they're industrializing, Madam Speaker, and they need access to the markets in the West. So if we put on sanctions for China, it's going to be devastating for their economy. Chinese government doesn't want that. They want their continued economic growth. And we've seen China oriented towards policy where economic growth is considered most important. No thank you. Also consider China and the West's interdependence. We see things like treasury bills. They can't see a devaluation or a breakdown of relations with the American government, given that we're so intertwined. No thank you. On other issues like climate change, Madam Speaker, we see China wanting a greater voice and wanting its own voice heard in negotiations. Look at Copenhagen, where China loved being part of the 5 countries that came to the most substantive version of a deal, Madam Speaker. Also, China wants legitimacy. There's a culture there that cares about standing, that cares about outcome. And when they get to hold the Olympics, when they get to be part of the climate change talks in Copenhagen, they feel part of the greater the global community, Madam Speaker. And they gain this sort of legitimacy in the global community that they desperately want, Madam Speaker. So they want the West. They need the West, Madam Speaker. And they are going to give into something that is relatively a minor concession, Madam Speaker, given that they're already shown a willingness to go forward the middle way, Madam Speaker, to go forward with greater autonomy. The West needs to show that it's not bluffing on human rights abuses, that it cares about human rights abuses, Madam Speaker. Because this means that if China considers doing further human rights abuses, or other countries consider doing human rights abuses, Madam Speaker, the West will show its willingness to stand up in very important ways, Madam Speaker. What have I told you in this speech? I tell you, we have to stand up for those rights that we care about in the West. Things like right to religion, right to self-determination, right to association and speech. And we also tell you that this is pragmatic, Madam Speaker, that China needs the West, it's going to negotiate, it wants to go forward with the middle way we propose.
Thank you very much. And I now please call the Leader of Opposition.
On Op today, we're going to be realists. It may come as no surprise to hear that we're going to concede that China behaves really badly in Tibet and has done so historically. We don't think that's going to win them the case. What we're going to tell you about is why we see no reason to believe that their policy leads to actual change and has massively negative consequences for lots of other human rights violations all around the world. So I'm going to bring you 2 things in substantive. Firstly, I'm going to tell you why this policy specifically damages our relationship with China. Secondly, I'm going to show you why we should prioritize that over abstract principles. But firstly, some rebuttal. So he gives us all this stuff about why China's behaved really incredibly badly in Tibet. What we're going to say is that, number one, we don't think we have any reason to believe from them that this in any way changes those incredibly bad things happening. And as I'm going to show you in my second point, we're going to take a pretty brutal consequentialist line on this and say we should prioritize all the other different kinds of things we can do with China over standing up for abstract principles. Secondly, he tells you about pragmatics. And frankly, ladies and gentlemen, we think this is a bit ridiculous. He tells you, firstly, that there is this possibility of a middle way in negotiation with China. We say, yes, that is a policy of constructive engagement with that state. We think that's not what they give you. They make you fundamentally antagonistic to you. Secondly, he tells you China needs the West. Therefore, we're perfectly able to stand up to them. We say that's simply untrue. Firstly, we think they have all sorts of other markets into which they can operate, right? So we see that, for instance, most of China's trade goes on with other Asian countries, in Africa, in the Middle East, and that's a massively growing part of their trade. That's where they get their natural resources from. But more than that, we say China's perfectly capable of standing up to the West. They assert that China needs the West. We say the West needs China just as badly. They tell you about treasury bills. We point out that half of the international reserve currency held in dollars in the world is held by the Chinese. And if Hu Jintao wakes up tomorrow morning and wants to destroy the US economy, he can by selling it onto global markets. Lastly, he tells you that they need standing, that they want standing in the international community. We say, yes, that's why in order to bring China on side, given that they have this culture, you have to treat them like an actual diplomatic player, rather than telling them that you think an enormous swathe of their territory should become independent. No thanks. No thanks, guys. Okay, why does this damage our relationship with China on other issues, this specific policy? There are 4 reasons. Firstly, we think we are at a unique point in our relationship with China. A slow burn policy of constructive engagement is starting to bear fruit. We see that after the Olympics, we are now in a position to start negotiating with China, engaging with them.
So,
they do feel like they're an international player. I'll take one.
The Dalai Lama doesn't want independence from Tibet. He wants substantial autonomy. He's even reduced the amount of land he's claimed as part of that autonomy. China's not going to look at this and taking away a huge swathe of their territory to put independence.
On the contrary, madam, sorry. I mean, firstly, First Gov tell us that, Tibet has a history of independence and that that's what the movement's founded in. We suggest that even if the Dalai Lama is capable of a pragmatic approach to partial autonomy, China's not going to stop viewing this as a question of independence. But back to this point about the unique point in the relationship, because we say we've started to get concessions from China on questions like Darfur, on questions like Iran. And what we do with this specific symbol is we turn our back on those concessions. We say, we don't care, we're not willing to reward you for them. Secondly, and this in fact ties in nicely with what Bronwyn was saying in her PMI, we think China has a mindset of keeping the whole territory together. It's really important to remember that Tibet isn't the only region within China that's asking for autonomy, right? We point you to things like the Uyghur Muslims in the West, we point you to Taiwan. What we say, ladies and gentlemen, is that those secessionist movements massively worry China. Just saying partial autonomy, right, doesn't stand. Because we think eventually that's going to grow into something else. But more than that, we don't think the Chinese Communist Party are particularly given to being like, oh yeah, we're not that big on, control of our territory, however strong that sovereignty is meant to be. No thanks, guys. Third point under why this damages our relationship with China. We say China has consistently shown a willingness to prioritize national interest over human rights issues. We say, given that they're going to see this as a violation of their national interest, exactly as we saw initially in Sudan, and gradually we've brought them into a position of change, we've been able to show them that we think their national interest can ally with also respecting human rights, that this is damaging. Fourthly, this policy bifurcates the global scene between the West and the East. That's particularly true when you start imposing sanctions, which I think was possibly the most shocking part of their model, right? When they say, you're not going to stand up in the UN and in the international community and tell China that they are not welcome in your club. That is not the way to achieve change. We think it's the way to get retaliation. No thanks, guys. Secondly, why are we going to prioritize other issues with China? Firstly, we tell you that this is not an arena where there is a possibility for meaningful change. We don't think that Tibet has any kind of power base on which we are likely to actually get the Chinese to change their policy. We think this is basically just empty talk. But secondly, we look at Tibet's magnitude versus all of the other issues on which we need Chinese support for human rights. We say that when Western governments look at human rights issues, they need to weigh the interests of every single victim of human rights abuses around the world equally. There are many people in Tibet, but there are also many people in Darfur, many people in Burma, many people in Iran, all of whom we need China's support to deal with. Why is this so? And this is the third point under this heading. It's about Chinese power, about why we absolutely need China. Firstly, in many cases, we need them because they have a veto on the UN Security Council. That's why we needed them to intervene in Sudan. Secondly, we think we often need them because they are the regional power in Asia. For instance, in Burma and in North Korea, China are the only people who can meaningfully negotiate with those states because they're the people with the power. And thirdly and finally, it's because China is now very seriously a global and international player on the world stage. No longer can the West make empty pronouncements about China without expecting them to fight back. They've got the size, they've got the money, they've got the ability to torpedo energy and trade negotiations. For all those reasons, we beg to oppose.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, members of the panel. So first off, I'm going to start with a new substantive point and then several points of rebuttal. But one thing I want to say about side opposition's case, I think it's compelling that they can see that the problem in Tibet is severe. That when Stephen talks to you about how through 1911, through 1950, these were a free people who were essentially invaded by the Chinese and saw themselves oppressed, they concede that that's the case. They just say the world isn't perfect enough, so we can't recognize them. They concede all of the problems of violations of free speech, about how China is trying to systematically exterminate the Tibetan people, and they concede that all these things are problems. As a consequence, the only ground they have left in the debate is the pragmatic one. If we can show you that we are pragmatically better, and we show you, as they've conceded, that we are far better on a principled ground, then it's a clear victory for side proposition. That having been said, several points, some new matter. So first off, we're going to talk about how we'll improve relations between the West and China, because they believe that there's literally no way things can improve. There's literally no way we can move forward, which is interesting because it would seem to be an argument that diplomacy and negotiations are always, there's nothing to be gained from them, and that you can never get China to move anywhere, which is interesting given that they also observed that China has moved on other human rights situations in the past, specifically Darfur. It seems strange to think that we could get them to move in some cases, but not in others, and we think there's good reason why we can move here. Why is this the case? Because right now, neither side can recognize the legitimacy of the other's claims, and this is a big stumbling block in relations. What does the U.S. say? The U.S. and other Western nations say that Tibet has a legitimate claim to self-rule. They should be granted autonomy or even independence. China says that it's this internal threat, and as a consequence, it represents a religious minority that they don't want. As a consequence, they don't want it to hurt their sovereignty. Why is this a problem? Because there's no middle ground in the status quo. The result is that it poisons relations, which we tell you are important to continue, and that having some kind of diplomatic recourse would be better. What do we think is better? Where we can reach some kind of compromise whereby those disagreements can be mitigated. And in fact, we think there's an interesting case study that they're going to have to deal with if they actually believe that China will never move on things like this and never accept an autonomous people. What might that be? A case like Taiwan, where China rhetorically can continue to say, yes, we have a one China policy. Yes, it's Chinese Taipei at the Olympics, and we recognize it, and it's still part of us. But guess what? Guess what in practice happens? This is an autonomous people who have been given self-rule, who are able to continue to exist. We think that case study, where guess what? The West has been the principal power broker for Taiwan, has helped prop them up, actually has led to exactly the same type of thing. Guess what? If the US and other Western nations did not support Taiwan, do you think Taiwan would have had the ability to remain independent? Obviously not. It's because of the support of the Western world that Taiwan has been given that autonomy. We think it's a devastating case study for them that demonstrates that when the US actually stands up to Chinese rights abuses, it does get meaningful concessions, because as both sides of the House concede, there are meaningful power arrangements that are at play, and they can be leveraged. Believe it or not, in the ideal diplomatic negotiating scenario, both sides have power, and as a consequence, you reach agreement. Go ahead.
No, because what the first part of your analysis shows us is that what China cares about is the symbolism, exactly what your policy violates.
No, you didn't listen to what Stephen said. He said, if we articulate this policy, we can get the middle way approach that the Dalai Lama approved in the 1990s, which was this. The Tibet would effectively have autonomous self-rule, but symbolically could remain part of China. China could get exactly what they want. That concession is devastating for them because it abrogates and accepts most of our case. So that having been said, first point of rebuttal. We're told that China does not need the West because it has other markets to sell to. I'm sorry, Madam Speaker, members of the panel, China needs the West. You don't achieve 8% economic growth by selling to like less developed countries and by excluding the West entirely from your markets. I'm sorry, your economy cannot grow so much. Imagine everything in the US that is made in China. It is absurd to say that China doesn't need the West substantially, that it doesn't need that as a trading partner. We also tell you, they also tell you, well, we need them to keep building, buying our T-bills, et cetera, particularly the United States. Yep, we agree. Both sides are dependent, which is why this is ideal for a negotiating scenario, to get both sides to concede something. We agree. Both sides have power and things that they want. As a consequence, when the U.S. threatens these things like economic sanctions, this will bring China to the table because neither side can continue to have this poisoning of the relationship, and we think that's important. The second argument, the second point of rebuttal, is that we're told that it damages our relationship with China, and they tell you that we've got negotiations on other things like Darfur, etc. So first off, we think it's important to send the message that to join things like the great economic powers, that you need to affirm human rights, and that to join the global community, you can't have a horrible record on this thing, or at least not make concessions that affirm that people have a right to self-determination, and that we think that's important. Moreover, they also tell you that they're worried about other autonomous people and the pressure they get from them. So first off, we think this is interesting given the case study of Taiwan, where China already has autonomous people within its border, and the world doesn't seem to have fallen apart. But we also think it's the case that, perhaps it's the case that China can use that as a bargaining chip and say, don't pressure us on these if you get them. They tell you that we need to affirm human rights generally. If we get more human rights on our side of the house, if we get constructively more autonomy, we think that's better than their world. We agree, ideally, we would affirm all human rights. If we can get farther in recognizing them and get more people with self-determination, we think that's particularly good. They tell us that, lastly, that we should, as third point of rebuttal, that we should prioritize our relationship over other things so that we can get along with China. And they tell us we can't get change. Here's why it's the case that in the status quo, Tibet cannot get change. Because it doesn't substantially have the support of the West. It doesn't have the West behind them in the same way that it needs. If the West goes behind Tibet and says, we recognize your claim, we think you have a right to autonomy, that makes it infinitely more likely to happen. We think that's the same way in the Taiwanese case study works. We think it also is particularly good for the West because it gives us moral legitimacy. We are attacking China on a claim where they are particularly weak, which is good reason why China will have to cede to us. Stephen gives you all sorts of analysis about how there are all sorts of negotiating chips at the table, and China doesn't want to hold out on this where it looks like an international pariah. We think that's particularly good reason to believe why this will happen. So what have we told you on side first proposition? We've told you that there is a principled rights claim here that we cannot abrogate. They would have you continue to ignore it and not give Tibet any leverage because they say it's a sunk cost. We've also told you why pragmatically we think it's going to be easy to access because there are diplomatic negotiations at play. This is the kind of thing that can go to the table and we can achieve it. We also win on the principles we propose.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to talk very briefly in my speech as a piece of rebuttal about principles, then I'll move on to the practicalities they've set out. Then I'm going to tell you why we think Tibetan secessionism is no longer an aim we necessarily want to encourage, and why we think it's not necessarily a good movement to encourage. And then I'm going to talk about the backlash this is going to create on Tibet itself, and why we think that's going to be incredibly counterproductive. So let's move on to a little bit of rebuttal. Now, essentially, their principle they've been standing on that I think is an important part of their case is that human rights are good and they want to stop that. We think that that's fairly uncontroversial. We're willing to accept up to them. But they want to free people. The top half wants to free Tibet totally. The bottom half seems to want to allow Tibet autonomy. We think that that's a little bit dubious. But more than that, we think it's interesting the way they seem to want to use other people that need an autonomous state, other people that are being repressed by China just as much as a bargaining chip in negotiations to free these particular people in China. Because we see that the Uyghurs are just as repressed in the Xinjiang province as the Tibetans. We think, thank you, that's enormously problematic work. There's gone there. We want to help protect the Darfurians by getting engagement from China. We want to get engagement from China and Iran in order to solve other enormous issues. We think you've conceded a lot of your principled ground with that. Then they told us that we're saying China won't move. No, that's not what we're saying at all. What we're saying is that China moving is best achieved by continuous creeping constructive engagement, and worst achieved by sanctions, by disempowering them and emasculating them on the world stage, and by shutting them out. We think that those are incredibly problematic, no thank you, and that's a very good recipe for never getting concessions in the future. We don't think that's actually a diplomatic recourse in the way they build it, no thank you. Then they told us about Taiwan. Now we think Taiwan is a little bit problematic here. Firstly, because the only reason Taiwan is actually separate from China right now is because there's an ocean and a US fleet between China and Taiwan. So we don't think it's, no thank you, an incredibly strong example of China accepting autonomous states, no thank you, outside them. We think China absolutely hates it, and China would do anything they could in order to stop it, and the US can't put a fleet between Tibet and China. Now, then they told us basically their only mechanism for how this actually creates change is that China will hate these sanctions because they need the West. Now we say, first off, need isn't enough, because China has shown itself to build a lot of its cultural identity and a lot of its cultural homogeneity on nationalism, which we think is not something that bows particularly well to the oppression and abuse, no thank you, by other nations. Second, we think we have shown you consistently that China will not accept it as a credible threat, because frankly, it isn't a credible threat for the West to sustain these kind of sanctions on China. No, thank you, we think China can reasonably expect them to fall apart, even if they do manage to pass them. So we don't think that stands up, and I'll take you on this, yes.
Sure. So your entire case is predicated on China committing belligerence and brinkmanship in response. I just don't understand why this is going to happen for a policy they've already agreed to in principle, namely the middle way for Tibet.
So, well, you've already told us how policies they agree to in principle aren't necessarily what they actually mean. I mean, we can see substantial examples of China not really believing this. For example, them like saying that the Dalai Lama is never going to be able to be reborn again, for example, which we don't see as a massively conciliatory kind of thing, no thank you, that they've been doing. But more importantly, we think our case is based on an enormous amount more. One, that you haven't shown us why they're going to accede to your demands. No, thank you. Further, I'm going to tell you now why Tibetan secessionism is a really dangerous thing to encourage. And also, that we think that there are enormous problems in the international sphere, and we think that it's not unreasonable to think that China's response to being sanctioned is not going to be friendly, especially in terms of making more concessions than they've already made in the international sphere. But why do we think Tibetan secessionism and even the Tibetan autonomy movement is no longer something we want to support? Because what we see is that the reality on the ground is that in China right now, in Tibet right now, especially in the developed areas, 30 to 40% of the people are Han minorities. We think this is incredibly, it sets an incredibly dangerous situation. Now what we saw in the 2008 riots was that the vast majority of the backlash was not territorially based, but became ethnically charged and ethnically based. The riots were primarily motivated against Han shopkeepers, involved burning Han shops, attacking Han inhabitants who either locked themselves in their upstairs homes or fled the cities. We think this is enormously dangerous, and we think that the fact that now, in the status quo, no thank you, the tension has been charged with ethnic tensions as well. We think it's incredibly dangerous to encourage this kind of movement because we think it's incredibly likely to result in hugely damaging human rights issues there in terms of backlash against Han, no thank you, minorities. We think it's incredibly dangerous. We think that if you could argue that the riots in and of themselves, which we think are likely to happen because of the symbolism of the event in the same way that they happen because of the symbolism of the occurrence of the Olympics in China, we think that if you could show, like conclusively, why that was almost certainly going to result in freedom and happiness for everyone, that it might be defensible. But you absolutely can't show that. And the reason you can't show that is because China has shown itself more than able to quash this kind of rebellion, and because we think China has an enormous incentive to quash this kind of rebellion. No, thank you. Because what we've shown you is that even though Tibet is the area where the Western powers focus their attentions on stopping separatist movements within China, China is a nation which is fundamentally built out of dozens of distinct separatist movements, all of which want freedom, and the second most dominant is the Xinjiang province movement. I mispronounced that terribly. No, thank you. So we think that's really dangerous. We think it means that China is going to do everything in its power to stop any sort of secessionist movement there. We moreover think it has this power. But Another reason we think there's going to be enormous backlash on Tibet, enormous restraints on what's going on there, such as, accelerating Han immigration, shutting down more temples, or clamping down on journalism, which they've done in the past and we think will do again, is because fundamentally their discourse on a national level is one of militaristic nationalism, and this is something that we can see in, for example, the 60th anniversary marches last year, where they were predominantly, dominated by a military tone. We think there's a lot of militaristic defensiveness on the nationalistic level in the discourse of China. We think this is going to shape their attitude towards attacks from the outside. We think that they've systematically shown throughout their history of engagement with the West that they prioritize nationalist goals and they prioritize their homeland over foreign affairs. We think that's incredibly important, but we think it's likely to result in the kind of backlash against the human rights situation in Tibet that we think is going to be counterproductive to proposition aims and we think is just not going to work. Thank you.
Madam Chair, like the Leader of the Opposition, I am a ruthless pragmatist when it comes to international relations. But that pragmatism does not lead this team to believe that we can seek constructive engagement in which China says what the terms are and we accept those terms. What we will bring to this debate is an analysis of how constructive engagement happens, which will fundamentally characterise China as, yes, a nationalist nation, which means that it is an insular nation, which doesn't want the glare of international scrutiny, and will do what it needs to do in incremental steps to remove that glare. We want to place that glare on them, force them to deal with Western actors that aren't necessarily governments, and signal the Dalai Lama's power as a moderate negotiator. But firstly and briefly, some rebuttal. Firstly, on damaging our relationship with China, because we need to seek constructive engagement by talking about every single other issue on which we have relations with China, but not this one. So firstly, our relationship with China has to be for something. When Richard Nixon visited China in 1973, it was with the knowledge that it was a regressive nation with regressive policies and with the understanding that the only reason why we would engage in trade and development with a nation like that was because of the belief that they would change. Morality matters in foreign policy. It matters that what we do is right. But what's more matters that what we do is seen to be right by a multitude of other nations that we are pushing the same principles with. When we tell Russia that they should allow more autonomy for Chechnya, they throw it back in our face that we deal with China because they're more economically important. When we tell Russia they shouldn't be promoting these kind of policies in Abkhazia, when we talk to the Arab world about their policies, when we talk to Indonesia about Timor-Leste and West Papua, it damages our stance that richer countries get better deals from them, and it destroys our ability to run a moral foreign policy anywhere in the world. Secondly, constructive engagement means leveraging power that both sides hold. Their response to this was to name every other priority in foreign policy that we might have with China. There are two things we say to that. Firstly, political capital isn't a pie that you divide up and only talk about some of those pieces of pie. It is something where you establish a principle and attempt to move incrementally on that principle in all spheres where it operates. But secondly, that the places where we have made changes are places like the Sudan where we kicked up a stink, where the whole Western media got on top of that, where celebrities, where Western nations were putting out statements, were speaking in the UN about why it was wrong that they dealt with that. And what's more, and I'm going to talk about this in our extension, where Western companies engaged in divestiture programs of Chinese firms that were dealing with Sudan that hurt it economically, despite the fact that it owns T-bills. Second thing we heard from this half was that China is too powerful. Firstly, we'd say both sides have power. and we each have the power to harm each other, and engaging in brinkmanship is about leveraging that in negotiations where we can both move in different directions. But secondly, we'd say that we have a natural power over China from countries which unfortunately haven't been mentioned, and most importantly Australia and Canada, who control the iron ore, which is the engine of that economy. Not being able to buy Rio Tinto was a huge harm for Sinalco, and it rose out of xenophobia in countries like Australia because they felt that they had immoral policies. This forces attention on China and means we get more pressure from those actors. And finally, we heard we shouldn't encourage secession. We'd say that people rioted in Tibet because they were dispossessed and because their leader has been exiled. The one force for stopping those riots was the Dalai Lama, who roundly condemned them. We need to make him more important. We need to signal our intention that he be more important, and I'm going to talk about that in our extension. So, how does the glare of international scrutiny force incremental change in China? But before that, yes.
How many Chinese leaders pledged to go to war over oil in Sudan and said that they would fight the US and withdraw from the world if Sudanese oil was not given a good trade deal?
China makes big statements about a lot of policies all the time. It fired missiles over Taiwan in a gesture of brinkmanship. We have to understand that it is about exercising power, exerting power, and signalling what your intentions are. There will not be a war over Tibet, especially over such a modest policy of letting the Dalai Lama go back and resume negotiations towards some form of autonomy. That will not happen. What will happen is that when we set a big goal, the Chinese will be forced to move to more incremental goals and take steps towards that. And that's the first plank of our extension, is about international scrutiny. We accept the characterization of China as a nationalist country, but the policy of peaceful development in China has been mostly built on protecting itself from the glare of the West and from not having scrutiny exerted over its internal affairs. How have we seen that? We saw that when the first time that we got real constructive mid-level negotiations was during the period up to the Olympics, when there was so much Western attention on China. We saw it when the most significant changes in China politically occurred after the huge media disaster and political disaster that was Tiananmen Square. We saw it when they were more prepared to accept things like pushes towards Taiwanese independence and formal Taiwanese independence after Western media started paying attention to a very important election going on in Taiwan as a result of that. So what we're doing here is to create a situation where we artificially create the same type of Western scrutiny that occurred during the Olympics, that same attention, and push China into a situation where they have to demonstrate what steps they're taking. Second part of our extension. We need to examine the fact that China can't negotiate in the same way as the West does with China with just one actor, and they're dealing with a multitude of actors who accept media signalling and who accept the signalling that comes from our foreign policy standpoints. So we think that when you look at the situation in Sudan, it wasn't just a situation of us negotiating with them. It was a situation of clear signals coming out from the West that this was wrong, of simply stating our position, and then any number of other actors within that responding to those positions. That's why we think you got movements like rejection of Rio Tinto sale to Sinalco in Australia. Not because the Australian government was against it, because various actors in Australian politics and Australian media pushed for it. That's why we think in the United States, when you've got such a divided political system with subcommittees in the House and the Senate controlling things like foreign affairs, that bullish Republicans who are responding to our foreign policy positions will be in a position to exert that pressure. But thirdly, we think that what we need to do in this situation is to signal the Dalai Lama's power in order to make him more important than any other actor who can represent the Tibetan position. We think that given the riots that were going on, there is a huge danger that internal radical forces who don't hold the same moderate positions as the Dalai Lama will become more powerful and will be the people who are seen as representing the Tibetan position. In a situation where the West clearly states to China and clearly states to the people of Tibet that the person to negotiate with is the Dalai Lama, it means that the more modest goals that he put out with the mid-level negotiations last year, like getting troops out of monasteries, like stopping the re-education of people within those monasteries to denounce the Dalai Lama, and like seeking talks towards autonomy, are the goals that are going to be sought. We need to remove the political capital from the radicals both in Tibet and on the Chinese side by signalling that the moderate way is the way to go. Ladies and gentlemen, China is nationalist, and the way that we exert pressure on a nationalist country is to put the scrutiny on it, to signal to independent actors in the West that this is the way to go, and to move towards moderacy in negotiations and not empower the radical elements. This motion must stand.
misunderstanding of Chinese history and a lot of misunderstanding about what exactly happens when you put pressure on China, when you put the flood lamps on or the glare of international labor or whatever it is. And I think that this is sort of evident throughout the prompt line, that they don't quite understand how this correlation or how this causal mechanism works. So to that end, what I want to do is bring two major arguments. First, I want to actually present the philosophical understanding of this round, which is whether there is a prima facie case for Tibet to be a sovereign nation, or a semi-autonomous independent entity, or whatever they want to call it. And secondly, I want to deepen some of the practical impacts that we've been drawing out on-site opposition. But before that, some of the points that we get from Sydney. The first argument we get is this notion that we can't have a moral foreign policy if we sort of pick and choose, if we pick some moral causes that matter and other moral causes that don't matter. And he's sort of right. It's hard to be consistent. But at the end of the day, we can't have any foreign policy if we don't pick and choose. And this is something that they fundamentally misunderstand. Look at the examples they give you. They say, look, what about Chechnya, right? How can we advocate for Chechnya if we don't advocate for Tibet? What about East Timor, Timor-Leste? How can we advocate there if we don't advocate for Tibet? Here's the problem, Madam Speaker, that if we actually put our heads out there, if we actually say Tibet must be independent, this is exactly the sort of rhetoric that scares Russia away from our position, that makes them think Chechnya or South Ossetia is next. This is exactly the sort of rhetoric that puts Russia and other Eastern countries in this defensive crouch, makes there appear to be another East versus West struggle. We are independent, we are free, and you guys can't manage that. This is exactly the sort of moral politics that undermines any efficacy in our other foreign policy. And these are exactly the things that they needed to consider, right? What we are going to get is not further liberation, what we're going to get is further repression. They talk about how, and this sort of leads nicely to their second point, they're like, look, when we bring this sort of moral look to them, or any look at China, things improve. And the two examples they give you are the Olympics and Tiananmen Square. These examples are laughable. After the Olympics, they seem to think that there was an era of Chinese liberation and freedom. Here's the truth. If anything, there was increased repression. More human rights lawyers were imprisoned after the Olympics than in any period in China's history. More people were, in fact, they say, let's talk about liberation. 20 people were killed for distributing leaflets that spoke of splitism, right? That distributed leaflets that spoke about an independent region. These are exactly the sort of things that happen when you create an existential threat to China, an existential threat to their territorial integrity. Tiananmen Square. They think, well, after Tiananmen, you had this era of Chinese freedom, right? After Tiananmen, what happened was you passed a law called the Administrative Procedure Law. And what you did was just hide the repression in the courts. What you did was create a legal veneer for the repression that took place, one that hid it from the West side, and one that continued the era of repression, right? I think it's laughable for them to say, we can just get China to move. What's the best argument we hear from side proposition in first prop? Well, China needs us. So if we say something, it'll go bad. And what do we hear from first off? Well, we need China. I think we can agree, we both need each other, and thus we have to pick and choose in our foreign policy. We have to choose what interests we want to prioritize and which interests we don't want to prioritize because of this. Then they say, look, at the end of the day, the Dalai Lama will sort of strengthen this movement, he'll be a moral leader, and he'll actually achieve something good for Tibet. And I think that this sort of leads nicely into the extension, which is a consideration of whether or not there is a prima facie case for Tibetan independence. So I want to clarify some of the revisionist history that we hear from First Prop. They say, look, Tibet was independent for all of 45 years, right? That's okay. Tibet was independent for all of 70 years in the past millennia, in the past 1,000 years. That's how many total years of independence Tibet has enjoyed. To say that Tibet should be an independent and sovereign nation, sort of, but in consideration of sort of how long Tibet has actually been independent, seems laughable at best. But look at what they're talking about, this 1911 movement where there was independence, right? They seem to think it was this real liberation battle, freedom fighters coming to the aid of Tibetans everywhere. At the end of the day, the people who led this were capitalist splitists who just wanted control of land in Tibet, right? It wasn't even clear they represented Tibetan interests in this area. Why did China take back the land in 1950? Why was it that after the new government came in place, China took back the land? It was because these exact splitists wanted to maintain their guanxi, or connections, corrupt connections, with the old government. They wanted to maintain the political kickbacks. These are exactly the reasons why China took back the land. Now, how they're treated today is, of course, not necessarily a good thing, and we're not claiming that. But that said, it's evident that this is fundamentally a domestic issue, right? For them to claim that Tibet has some prima facie claim to be an independent nation, that they are truly an independent people, is ridiculous.
We got change on Sudan after pushing China, making clear statements and forcing actions by various actors. That's when we get change, not when we sit back, relax, and let them do what they want.
That's fine, and I don't think that at all this proves anything we've said, which is you need to pick and choose what battles you fight, right? Do you want movement in Sudan, or do you want movement in Tibet, where there isn't even a clear case they should have complete autonomy, right? This is exactly the sort of claim we're bringing forward, and one that you don't seem to understand. But that said, let's look at today, right? I don't even want to talk about the past 1,000 years. Is Tibet significantly different enough to be a nation today? Absolutely not. First of all, we hear there's a significant Han minority, right? 30 or 40% from first off. But more than that, 5 in every 6 Tibetans have a Han relative, right? 5 or are part Han themselves. This goes to show that, even if China was, constructing this, moving Han in and intermixing, at the end of the day, today they are intermixed, and that's a reality we have to deal with, right? Even if the way we got there wasn't the most legitimate, that's a reality we have to confront and one we have to consider. On top of that, consider the fact that there are critical transportation and economic links between Lhasa and Beijing, between the Tibetan provinces, between Tibet, the province, not the provinces, and central China, right? These are all things that need to be maintained. These are all things that allow for any viable Tibetan autonomy, right? What actually happens? Let's say we were to grant them all this ground, that for some reason Tibet should be given independence, even though we think that's a very hard claim to make and they need to do much more to that end. Will this actually be efficacious? And that's the sort of last thing I want to talk to you about. Deep in the sort of practical impacts of what happens when you not only move towards Tibetan independence, but they miss one of the words in the children, right? Give the Dalai Lama the power as the head political actor in this area. Do you actually get benefits from Tibet? Absolutely not. And there are a few reasons for this. First of all, what they miss is that Chinese leaders personally hate the Dalai Lama, right? It's not enough to just talk about power politics. Personalities become involved when you come to China, and this is one of the things that they fundamentally miss. So even if Tibet were to make progress, which it can, which we believe on our side that it's possible without doing this, because you can look at Hong Kong, you can look at Taiwan and see that China is willing to give and is willing to take and give, right? Is willing to give things like exclusion from the one-child policy, federally devolved governments, affirmative action for ethnic minorities, right? These are all things that exist in China, but they happen when you coax them towards this, right? Not when you make a stand like this. And one thing they miss is that Tibetan leaders, or Chinese leaders, hate the Dalai Lama. What happens every time the US backs the Dalai Lama? Moderates in Tibetan society also are undermined, right? Moderates can't make the claim to come to power. What you see is at the end of the day, there are a lot of benefits for Tibet to be gotten by taking a slow strategy and not the foolhardy one they propose on off. And there's a lot of history that they forget on their side, and it's one I'd like to bring to you.
Thank you very much. And now please talk to the
Madam Chair, my speech today will be structured very simply. That is, their extension, our extension, and some issues from the opening half that need to be tied up. So, the extension of the closing half of the opposition side. They first of all disputed that Tibet has a prima facie case for independence. Not only does that ring in tension with their opening half, but we just do not accept that that prima facie case doesn't exist. They talked about how Tibet existed for millennia without effective independence, in an area of the world where lots of those people didn't have effective independence as we conceive of it today. They did have substantial independence in a modern sense for a particularly long time. But moreover, the individuals and the government in Dharamsala want independence. There is an ethnic group that is distinctly the majority and distinctly different from the rest of the people in that area. And moreover, their repression under China gives them a pretty solid case for independence. It ticks several of the boxes on which we allow self-determination or even just substantial autonomy in the modern world for most states. So we just reject this bizarre and boring modern history lesson from the closing opposition that they don't have a primary facie case for independence. Because that disagrees with most of the academia and diplomacy on the issue. Guys, China thinks that. Big freaking surprise, right? They said that the Han are simply too mixed in with the rest of the population, Madam Chair. First of all, the oppression of the Han that they talked about, the riots that are occurring, were quelled by the Dalai Lama. He is a moderating force on the minority of Tibetans who would hurt the Han minority in that region. We talked about in our extension, and this didn't get much of a response, about how if you don't allow the Dalai Lama to step in and negotiate in the fashion that he has, and to quell that rioting, principally because his religion encourages him to do so, it means that those radicals that are gaining the ascendancy now continue to gain that ascendancy. Moreover, we'd indicate that these groups need to get on, and that simply cannot happen when the oppressed majority feel entirely dispossessed, because substantial autonomy isn't going to mean the Han are shut out, that the Han don't have freedoms, and the Han can't continue to be oftentimes the upper class in Tibet as they are currently. Moreover, we talk about the fact that as we said in our extension, scrutiny and making China act is the only way of stopping that kind of repression from happening in Tibet. No, thank you. Take a seat. So we would dispute that there isn't a prima facie case for independence. We would dispute that this action necessarily imperils the tiny Han minority in Tibet, Madam Chair. So, on to our extension in this debate today. Take a seat. Tim and I said that we want to exploit the inherent and oftentimes ferocious nationalism of China. The only time we've ever got real movement on Chinese policy, particularly regarding internal policy, is when the West focuses media scrutiny, works corporately, and isn't just an isolated state like Australia or the UK or America, and actually works corporately to force China to feel that nationalism is in some way threatened. Take a seat. So we need that Western scrutiny. They basically said that doesn't work. They pointed to Beijing and said that after Beijing, there was increased repression. Exactly, because all the sports journalists left and no one was looking anymore. The answer to that is to increase and maintain that scrutiny in the fashion that we did with the Uyghurs and in the fashion that reduced the oppression of those Uyghurs and meant that the Chinese military weren't quite literally gunning them down in the streets anymore. So that cause effect is probably a useful example for our side of the house. They then said China didn't change after Tiananmen Square, which is just mind-bogglingly dumb, right? Because the greatest changes in Chinese foreign policy have resulted after the huge cultural change within China after Tiananmen Square, and moreover the huge change in public feeling in the West that said that is not okay, that pressured their governments to pressure China, that saw the entire Western world saying to people like Hu Jintao, open up even just a little bit and make life better for your people. Students in Beijing have substantially more freedom now than they did in 1988, Madam Chair. We've talked about how you can't negotiate with just one actor, say the UK for example, because that one actor doesn't have power. We need multipolar pressure on China to gain any kind of ascendancy, any kind of incremental change. Take a seat. We talked, moreover, and this hasn't gotten much of a response from the opposition side, about how useful it is to support the Dalai Lama specifically, because he's a useful, moderate negotiator. He has actually reduced the total area of land that he demands as an autonomous, not independent state for Tibet in response to Chinese demands that he lessen his goals and that he moderate them somewhat. He did that. He quelled the rioting in Tibet the last time that it occurred. He has overwhelming popular support amongst Tibetan people more generally. He is a useful actor, and that has signalling power that the West doesn't want an independent Tibet, doesn't want a crazy Tibet that oppresses its Han minority, but that it wants a middle way Tibet with a popular leader who is moderate, who is willing to recognize broad symbolic Chinese sovereignty. The last point of our extension, before I do that, I'll take the podium.
Sure. Given that China views losing territorial integrity as an existential threat, how exactly do you propose they move towards this liberated?
Well, first of all, territory isn't the only important interest that China has given up in the past. It gave up economic interests when we pressured them on Darfur. So we're not willing to say that China won't give up interests when it is faced with media scrutiny. So let's just get rid of that idea in this debate right off the bat. Moreover, we think that we're not taking away their territory. Not only is this a small portion of land just generally, Madam Chair, with not that much overwhelming economic importance to China, it's also not independence, guys. And the Dalai Lama is probably the best actor to ensure that that doesn't become the call from the rioters in the streets in Tibet, Madam Chair. We talked about engagement with China, about how this only happens when you increase media glare, when you increase government glare on the people who are acting to oppress the Tibetans. They said pick our battles in response to the Sudanese example, which is exactly right. They conceded that when we focused on Sudan, when we tried to take action on that, we got results. We pick this battle, Madam Chair. The Tibetans are being systematically A, killed, and B, just generally oppressed. That is a moral stain on the hands of the West. Madam Chair, the proposition picks this particular battle. Very briefly, issues from the opening half. Can we pressure China? Well, sure. It's a reciprocal relationship, which means there's reciprocal interests on both sides, and this is a modest policy. We absolutely think we can because we've pressured them, as we said in our extension, in a variety of other ways, in a variety of other issues. They tread softly with secessionist movements. Doing this doesn't necessarily mean the West has to accept the fundamental case for Uyghur independence. There's every reason why we can have sensitive differentiated policy, right? Moreover, how does this change the situation in Tibet? The basic only problem they had is that this will increase rioting. I've said time and time again, particularly rioting against the Han minority, the Dalai Lama is the best mechanism, the best individual to reduce that kind of unrest, to reduce that violence. He's a popular leader with overwhelming popular support. And he is a negotiator that the Chinese are actually willing to come to the table to meet. So, given all of that, Tim and I stand an extremely proud proposition.
Rounds will begin where they will hopefully end, at a bar. And with that being said, now that we've completed the karmic circle, I'd like to talk about the rounds we've just had. Because I think ultimately that they've made some grievous errors, and ultimately they've damned their case. So there's 3 questions I'm going to bring you today. First, is recognition worthwhile? That is, even in a world with no power politics, is it a good thing to promote the Dalai Lama? Second, will we get meaningful change on the ground? Will this do anything to actually promote the good of the people, or the middle way, as opening proposition said? And finally, even if it did do good, would this good be outweighed by the raw power politics worldwide? Would it be the sort of fight we need to engage in? So the first question is recognition worthwhile? Is this a legitimate cause? So the first proposition's warrant was rights abuses are occurring, rights are being harmed. This doesn't mean that a nation has a right to autonomy or independence. Many rights abuses occur. This doesn't mean that a nation occurs. Recognizing this, the second proposition takes an entirely different line. They say, actually, Tibet really wants to be independent. For example, look to the minorities. So here's the specific truth. First, the Dalai Lama is perceived as highly popular because he has a great Western publishing agency, because he's able to promote himself. He's like the Bono, the U2 of Tibet. But average Tibetans on the ground in opinion polls say they don't care about this issue. Say what they actually want is to live a stable life, to not feel incursions, to be protected. Who elected the Dalai Lama? The answer, the Western media, not the Tibetan people themselves. This is the key part of this round, and that's what they needed to grapple with. Moreover, we gave you the actual historical analysis behind this. That Tibetan nationalism as it exists today is the product of unelected aristocrats in 1900, not millennia of history. The issue is not, as second proposition spuriously claimed, that we fear more riots will occur. It's that Tibet never was a nation, that this is an internal issue. No, thank you. We believe at the point where this is true, we believe that Tibet does not have this claim, and the Dalai Lama specifically cannot claim to be their actual leader. We believe that recognizing him does say his cause is valid. Now the final thing under this, the final issue, is a false contradiction, which they've claimed to pin us down in. They say, the first bench says you want some degree of autonomy, but you say this autonomy is illegitimate. This is incorrect. What we're saying is what the Dalai Lama stands for, a special type of autonomy, which Tibet is not part of China. The symbol he represents is unacceptable and is not worth fighting for, but an autonomous Tibet is. Which brings us to our second point. Who actually gets an autonomous Tibet? Because I think both sides of the House have reached an agreement. What do we want for the Tibetan people, who are the ones that actually matter in this round? We want them to have a degree of self-determination. We want them to not have to be afraid when their children go to school, not be afraid when they take their views. I'll take you up to this point. We want them to actually have a good life. But the question is, who actually gets it? How are you going to get us there?
Given that there are competing voices for Tibetan nationalism, and some of them are murdering Han Chinese in the streets, shouldn't we signal clearly that the people who have the negotiating power are moderates like the
You know what? I was going to get to it later. I'll get to it now. The Dalai Lama is moderate because once he stopped a riot. That is the line coming from their side of the house. Look how moderate he is now. The Dalai Lama's position, his philosophy, is not considered moderate. Not by the Chinese, not within Tibet. He's done a good job of positioning himself as moderate in this particular high visibility situation. But make no mistake, the Dalai Lama's firm stand is for an independent Tibet in a manner that would be unacceptable to China. We don't believe that the fact that he stopped a riot once proves your case. So how do we get meaningful change towards this goal? There's this notion that there's a pie, right? And there's only one type of pie. It's delicious and it's all the same. Here's a slice of Sudan, here's a slice of press freedom, here's another slice. But most august House, Tibet is a very special pie. Because Tibet is a piece of the pie within China's territorial integrity. Tibet is a piece of the pie which China's leaders have pledged will never be allowed to leave. Tibet is a piece of the pie which China has said that they would risk economic devastation, that they would lose the Olympics over, that they would fight to the death over. Why does this matter? The specific nature of China's regime. China was once premised on communism. It didn't work out. That's why everything's now made in China. Problem. If the regime is to remain legitimate, it must preserve this nationalist territorial integrity. The issue is not, as second proposition claimed, that it's just a little bit of territory. The issue is the symbol it sends that the regime has no more legitimacy, that the regime has no right to rule. And because of this, we believe that if China is to let Tibet go, its leadership faces an existential crisis. Why does this matter? Because this is radically different from every example they brought up. They gave you the example of Sudan. They gave you the example of greater press freedom. These are not existential threats. The Chinese party can still rule China, can still be a legitimate voice for China if it has less good oil from Sudan. What it cannot do is stay in power and at the same time see the territorial integrity on which its entire party is premised. So what's going to happen? Well, they say the glare of media scrutiny and the fact that we're all calling with one voice will create a gigantic change. For example, as we've seen on Taiwan. The only reason China has not struck back is because Taiwan has enough guns to defend itself. That's the only reason we haven't seen them come back. But we've seen no philosophical concession on this issue. Moreover, though, we think that you have a significant problem at the point where, as we saw in the Olympics, as we saw in Tiananmen Square, China will engage in this sort of repression. So they talk about economic leverage. They say, we need them and they need us. It's all one big happy family. What's the problem? China sees this as a fundamental issue to their rights and to their protection. We see it as a peripheral issue, which is nice to have. We're going to blink first. We're not going to actually win at brinksmanship. But moreover, we think that by promoting the Dalai Lama, we impede moderates. We have this assertion that the Dalai Lama is this moderate leader and he's wonderful. No. When you endorse this visible symbol who is personally hated by the regime, you prevent actual moderates from coming to power. China has been very reasonable with its internal minorities if they're willing to concede on symbolism. And this is a really important point which Zion brought out. Namely that minorities in China are well treated until they want independence. So in Inner Mongolia, you have self-determination rights, no problem. The reason the Uyghurs are persecuted is because they say, we want Uyghurstan, and that's where the problems come from. We believe that the Dalai Lama is a symbol. He's a symbol personified, and as a result, until he is gone, no change will actually occur. We believe that there is a meaningful path forward, that China's recent concessions, which they talk about, have occurred because the Dalai Lama has been gone, and ultimately this is the only path forward. But finally, the question of power politics. Because we believe there are many slices of pie out there if only we're willing to abandon this one. What do we see? First, concessions on things like global warming, concessions on things like Sudan, concessions on broader human rights. We think China will have a tremendous nationalist backlash against America, that they'll see this as an incursion, and that we won't be able to make progress. It doesn't matter if the West works together, if China feels its existence is on the line, and that's what we've presented. But what about the rest of the world? Doesn't this impede our moral standing? No. Because in the rest of the world, there's this question. Will America allow territorial integrity? Will it allow national identity? Or will it crusade for human rights and be moralizing upon the world? If we endorse this, we lose Russia, we lose Iran, we lose the Middle East, because these states will see the U.S. as a threat, as a moralizing terror. And when they do so, we lose the power to defend our actual meaningful interests. Fight the right fight, vote side up.